3 weeks after the storm, Dr. Una Park sat in a waiting room in the heart of the Galactic Union diplomatic complex. She had been summoned here by a message that provided no details, only a time and a location and an instruction to attend. Her arms were still encased in regenerative casts, thin white sheaths that hummed softly as they worked to repair the nerve damage she had sustained. The doctor said she would make a full recovery, though it might take months before she regained complete feeling in her fingers. She was not sure why she was here. The expedition had been cut short after the storm, with the entire team evacuated back to Union space while the site was assessed for safety. Una had spent most of the intervening weeks in a medical facility, undergoing treatment and trying not to think about what would happen next. She had assumed her career was over. She had disobeyed a direct order from her superior, after all, and nearly gotten herself killed in the process. The fact that she had saved 3 lives seemed unlikely to matter to the bureaucrats who made decisions about such things. The door opened and a young human aide stepped inside. "Dr. Park," he said. "They are ready for you." Una rose and followed him down. Long corridor lined with the flags of 100 different species. At the end was a set of massive doors carved from some kind of dark wood that she did not recognize. The aide pushed them open, and Una stepped into the largest room she had ever seen. The Galactic Union Council Chamber was designed to impress and intimidate. In equal measure, seats rose in tiers on all sides, filled with representatives from dozens of species, their eyes all fixed on the small human woman who walked slowly down the central aisle at the front of the chamber. A raised platform held the speaking podium, and behind it sat the 3 Valkyries she had come to know so well. The 2 adults had healed from their injuries and sat tall and proud in their ceremonial robes between them. In a smaller seat of honor sat Ketan, with Sora and Ven on either side. Una stopped at the edge of the platform, unsure of what she was supposed to do. "Dr. Una Park," a voice boomed from the speakers. "You have been summoned to hear the declaration of the Valkyrie Dominion regarding their application for membership in the Galactic Union." The elder Valkyrie rose from their seat and moved to the podium. In the weeks since the storm, Una had learned that her name was Ambassador Sathara and that she was one of the highest-ranking members of her species. The fact that it was her children who had been in danger made what happened next even more remarkable. "We came to observe the Galactic Union," Sathara began, her voice carrying through the silent chamber. "We wish to see how its member species behaved, how they treated each other, how they valued life." What we witnessed was revealing. She paused, and her eyes swept across the assembled representatives. "We saw a species that claimed to value strength above all else, assign meaningful tasks only to their own kind, while dismissing others as inferior. We saw leaders ignore warnings from their subordinates because they believed they knew better. We saw pride and arrogance that nearly cost lives." Several of the Krellian representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "But we also saw something else," Sathara continued, and her voice softened. "We saw a human woman, small and overlooked and treated with contempt, risk her own life to save children who were not her own. We saw her walk into a storm that would have killed creatures twice her size. We saw her hold our cubs through a night of cold that should have killed her." She turned to look directly at Una. "When we found her in the morning, her arms were frozen in place around our children. She could not let go even if she had wanted to. Her body had chosen to protect them even when her mind was no longer conscious to make that choice." The chamber was utterly silent. "In Valkyrie culture," Sathara said, "there is no greater honor than to protect the young. It is the measure by which we judge all beings. And by this measure, humans are not the weak species we were told they were." She raised her hand and pointed at Una. "This woman weighs less than any of our adolescents. She has no claws, no protective fur, no natural weapons. She was told she was worthless, and she was treated as if she did not matter. And when the moment came, she gave everything she had to keep our children alive. That is not weakness. That is a kind of strength that we did not know existed. Sithara turned back to face the council. The Velthari Dominion has made its decision. She announced, "We will join the Galactic Union. But we have one condition." A murmur ran through the chamber. Humanity must be recognized as a full and equal member of the Union. Sithara declared, no more treating them as junior partners. No more assigning them to menial tasks while others do the important work. If this union wishes to have the Velthari among its members, it must first acknowledge the worth of those who have already proven their value. The debate that followed was brief. Several Krellian representatives objected, but their protests were quickly overruled. Humanity had been fighting for recognition in the Union for years, and now, because of what one small woman had done in a storm on a distant moon, that fight was finally over when the vote was called. It was nearly unanimous. As the chamber began to empty, Una felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to find Torvax standing behind her. The Krellian looked different somehow. Smaller perhaps, though she knew that was impossible. "Dr. Park," he said, and his voice carried none of the contempt she had grown used to. "I owe you an apology." Una was too surprised to respond. "I judged you based on the size of your body," Torvax continued. "And I was wrong. I have never been more wrong about anything in my life." He extended his hand in the human gesture of respect. "Among my people, this acknowledgement of error is called Vashtak," he said. "It is not given lightly. I hope you will accept it." Una looked at his hand for a long moment. Then she reached out with her own bandaged fingers and shook it. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you know." After Torvax departed, Una found herself surrounded by the three cubs she had held through the longest night of her life. They pressed against her legs, their purrs vibrating through her entire body. Ketan reached up and placed something in her hand. It was a bracelet, woven from strands of silver and gold that caught the light like captured stars. "We made it for you," the cub said shyly. "It is a tradition among our people." "What does it mean?" Una asked. "It means you are one who held us in the dark." Sora said, "It means you are family now." Then the smallest stretched up and pressed their forehead against Una's bandaged hand, just as their mother had done weeks before. "It means we will never forget." They whispered. Una looked down at the bracelet, then at the three small faces looking up at her with love and gratitude and something that looked remarkably like pride. They had called her weak. They had laughed at her size and dismissed her worth, but she had held on when no one else would have, and she had kept the fire of three small lives burning through the darkness, and that, she realized, was the only kind of strength that truly mattered. Myra Sung had not slept at all during the long night of the storm. She had spent the hours pacing the emergency shelter, staring out the reinforced windows, and arguing with anyone who would listen about the need to send a search party for Una. No one listened. Torvax had declared that the human woman was certainly dead, and that risking more lives to recover a corpse would be foolish. The other Krellians agreed, and the rest of the crew was too afraid to challenge them. But when the storm finally began to weaken and the first pale light of dawn crept across the devastated camp, Mira was the first one out the door. She did not wait for permission. She did not ask for help. She simply grabbed a medical kit and ran. The camp was unrecognizable. Structures that had stood the day before were now twisted ruins of metal and composite materials. Equipment worth millions of credits lay scattered across the ground like discarded toys. The transport pods had been torn from their moorings and thrown dozens of meters, and Mira felt her heart sink when she saw that the pod where the Velthari cubs had been sheltered was empty. But the cubs were Not there, which meant Yuna had reached. Then Mira began to search in a systematic grid pattern, calling out Yuna's name as she picked her way through the debris behind her. She could hear others emerging from the shelter. Could hear Torvax's voice booming orders about damage, assessment, and salvage priorities. She ignored all of it, 20 minutes into her search. She found the rocky outcropping on the eastern edge of the camp. At first, she could not understand what she was seeing. There was a shape huddled in a small alcove. A shape that looked vaguely human, but was covered in a layer of frost and ice. And wrapped around that shape were 3 small figures that lifted their heads and blinked at Mira with golden eyes. "Here!" Myra screamed, her voice cracking. "She is here! I found her!" She dropped to her knees beside the alcove and reached out with trembling hands. Yuna was conscious, but barely so. Her eyes unfocused and her lips a terrifying shade of blue. Her arms were still wrapped around the cubs in a grip that looked almost like rigor mortis. "Yuna," Myra said, fighting back tears. "Can you hear me?" "Cubs," Yuna whispered, so quietly that Myra had to lean in to hear her check the cubs first. Myra ran her scanner over the 3 small Valkyrie and let out a breath of relief when the readings came back positive. They were cold but stable. Their vital signs within acceptable parameters. They were going to be fine. Yuna was another matter. Her core temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, and the scanner detected frostbite in her fingers, nerve damage in her arms from prolonged muscle strain, and at least 2 cracked ribs. She needed immediate medical attention. "Can you let go?" Myra asked gently. "Can you release the cubs?" Yuna's eyes filled with something that might have been fear. "I cannot," she said. "My arms. They will not move." Others arrived then, drawn by Myra's shouts. A medical team rushed forward with thermal blankets and emergency equipment while crew members stood back and stared in disbelief at the sight before them. The cubs had to be carefully extracted from Yuna's frozen grip, each one meowing in protest as they were pulled away from the warmth they had clung to all night. When they were finally free, Yuna's arms remained locked in place, curved around empty air as if she was still holding something. "Precious muscle damage," the medical officer said grimly as she examined Yuna. "She held that position for so long that the tissue has partially frozen in place." "Will she recover?" Myra demanded. "With treatment?" "Yes, but it is going to be a long process." They loaded Yuna onto a stretcher and began carrying her back toward the shelter. As they walked, Mira became aware of a commotion behind them. The 2 adult Valkyrie, both still injured from the night before, were pushing their way through the crowd. The one with the broken arm moved awkwardly, but with a determination that nothing could stop. When they reached the stretcher, they stopped and stared down at Yuna with an expression that Myra could not read. "Our cubs," the Valkyrie with the shoulder wound said. "You saved our cubs." Yuna's eyes struggled to focus on the speaker. "They are safe," she managed. "Told you I would keep them safe." The Valkyrie reached out with their uninjured arm and touched Yuna's frozen, damaged hand with a gentleness that seemed at odds with their fierce appearance. Then they did something that made every member of the crew stop and stare. They pressed their forehead against Yuna's fingers in a gesture that Myra recognized from her cultural briefings as one of the most sacred rituals in Valkyrie society. It was the acknowledgement of a life debt, a bond that could never be broken. "We will not forget," the Valkyrie said. "For as long as our line continues, we will not forget what you did." By the time they reached the medical bay, word had spread through the entire camp. The small human woman who had been dismissed and mocked and assigned to menial tasks had walked into a storm that would have killed most species and had kept 3 children alive through the longest night any of them had ever known. Crew members who had ignored Yuna the day before now stepped aside as her stretcher passed. Their eyes filled with something that looked like respect. Even the Krellians were silent. Torvax stood in the doorway of the medical bay, watching as Yuna was carried inside. His expression was unreadable, but Mira noticed that he did not offer any of his usual dismissive comments. For once, the great senior researcher seemed to have nothing to say inside the bay. The medical team worked quickly to stabilize Yuna's condition. They warmed her core temperature slowly and carefully to avoid shock, treated the frostbite on her fingers with regenerative compounds, and immobilized her arms in specialized casts that would help the damaged muscles heal. Through it all, Yuna drifted in and out of consciousness, but whenever she opened her eyes, the first thing she asked about was the cubs. They are fine, Myra assured her again and again. Their parents are with them now. They're going to be okay thanks to you. Late that afternoon, when Yuna was finally stable enough to receive visitors, the door to the medical bay opened and 3 small figures crept inside. Ketan, Sora, and Ven climbed onto the bed with the careful movements of children who knew they were supposed to be gentle. They curled up around Yuna, pressing their warm fur against her bandaged arms. "What are you doing?" Yuna asked weakly. "You kept us warm," Ketan said simply. "Now we are keeping you warm." Yuna closed her eyes, and for the first time since the storm had begun, she smiled outside the medical bay. The sun was setting over the ruins of the camp. The storm had passed and the work of rebuilding would begin tomorrow, but something else had changed too. Something that could not be measured in credits or equipment. The galaxy had been given a reminder of what humans were capable of, and it was a lesson that none of them would soon forget. The first hour was difficult. The second hour was agony. By the third hour, Yuna had stopped counting. The cold had become a living thing, a creature with teeth and claws that gnawed at her flesh without mercy. Her thermal jacket was wrapped around the cubs, which meant her back was pressed directly against the frozen stone with nothing but her thin uniform between her skin and the rock. She could no longer feel her fingers. Her arms had cramped into rigid bands of pain around the small bodies in her lap, and every breath felt like swallowing ice. The cubs had stopped shivering, which frightened her more than anything else. Hypothermia in Veltari presented differently than in humans. She remembered from her xenobiology courses. They grew still and quiet as their bodies conserved energy, slipping into a state that looked like sleep, but could easily become something more permanent. "Hey," Yuna said, her voice hoarse. "Wake up, little ones. You need to stay awake." The largest cub stirred against her chest. "Tired," they mumbled. "I know you are tired," Yuna said, "but I need you to talk to me. Can you tell me your names?" There was a long pause, and Yuna felt her heart clench with fear. Then the cubs spoke again, their voice small and weak. "I am Ketan," they said. "The middle one is Sora. The smallest is Ven. Those are beautiful names." Yuna said, "My name is Yuna." "We know," Sora said from somewhere beneath the jacket. "We watched you earlier." "Mother said you seemed sad." Yuna let out a laugh that was dangerously close to a sob. "I was a little sad," she admitted, "but I am not sad right now. Right now I am very grateful that I get to be here with you." Another electromagnetic burst lit up the sky, and the thunder that followed shook the stone at her back. The wind screamed past the entrance of the alcove, carrying ice and debris and the sound of destruction. "Why did you come for us?" Ketan asked. The others stayed inside where it was safe. "You came out into the storm." Yuna thought about the question. She thought about all the complicated answers she could give, about duty and honor and the value of every life. But in the end, she gave the only answer that was true. "Because you were alone and you were scared," she said, "and I could not leave you out here by yourselves." The smallest cub, Ven, lifted their head and looked up at Yuna with eyes that reflected the distant lightning. "Even though we are not your cubs, even though you are not my cubs." Hours passed. The storm showed no sign of weakening, and the cold continued to deepen until Yuna was certain that the temperature had dropped below anything her body was designed to survive. She could feel herself slipping, her thoughts growing fuzzy at the edges, her grip on consciousness becoming uncertain. But her arms never loosened. Every time she felt herself beginning to fade, she would feel one of the cubs shift against her chest or hear one of them whimper in their sleep, and she would force herself back to alertness. She could not let go. She would not let go. "Tell us a story," Sora said sometime in the middle of the night. "I do not want to sleep anymore." Yuna's mind was slow and clouded, but she reached back through her memories until she found something she could share. "When I was a little girl on Earth," she began, her words slurring slightly. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about a magic tiger who protected children from monsters." "What is a tiger?" Ketan asked. "It is an animal from my planet," Yuna said. "It has orange fur with black stripes, and it is very fierce and very strong. But in the stories my grandmother told, the magic tiger was also very gentle with the children it protected. It would curl around them and keep them warm through the coldest nights." She was rambling now, mixing together different stories from her childhood, tales of guardian spirits and protective animals and brave heroes who faced impossible odds. But the cubs listened with rapt attention, their small bodies pressed against hers. And for a little while, the story seemed to push back the cold. "You are like the tiger," Ven said when Yuna's voice finally gave out. "No," Yuna whispered. "I am just a human. I am small and weak. You are warm," Ven said simply. "And you are here." The night stretched on. At some point, the wind changed direction and began to blow directly into the alcove, driving ice and snow against Yuna's exposed back. She shifted her body to block the entrance as much as possible, hunching forward over the cubs until her spine screamed in protest. Something cracked in her rib cage, and sudden sharp pain joined the dull ache that had become her constant companion. Still, she did not let go. Her arms had become locked in position, the muscles so cramped and frozen that she was not certain she could release the cubs, even if she wanted to. The frostbite had set in hours ago, turning her fingers white and then blue. But she could not bring herself to care about the damage she was doing to her own body. All that mattered was keeping the cubs warm. All that mattered was getting them through the night. "Yuna," Ketan said softly, "you are shaking very badly." "I know," Yuna managed. "I will be okay." "Your lips are blue. That happens sometimes." There was a pause. "I'm sorry we could not help you stay warm," Ketan said, and there was guilt in her young voice. "You are helping," Yuna assured them. "You are giving me something to hold on to. That is exactly what I need." She began to sing then, an old Korean lullaby that her mother had sung to her when she was small. Her voice was broken and weak, barely more than a whisper. But she forced herself to continue. The act of singing kept her conscious, gave her something to focus on besides the cold and the pain. The cubs listened in silence, their small hearts beating against her chest like the flutter of bird wings. When she finished the song, she started it again from the beginning. She sang it 4 times before the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the storm clouds. The wind was dying down. The electromagnetic bursts had become less frequent. The worst was over. "Yuna," Sora said, "the sky is getting lighter." Yuna tried to respond, but found that she could not make her mouth form words. The cold had finally caught up with her, as she could feel her consciousness slipping away, like water through her fingers, but her arms remained locked around the cubs, holding them close even as darkness closed in around the edges of her vision. The last thing she heard before she lost consciousness was Ketan's voice, small and fierce. "Do not worry, Yuna," the cub said. "Now it is our turn to keep you warm." She felt 3 small bodies press closer against her chest, felt the combined heat of their fur against her frozen skin, and then she felt nothing at all. The storm hit 3 hours before it was supposed to arrive, and it hit with a fury that none of them had anticipated. Yuna was still in the storage bay when the first blast of wind struck the camp like the fist of an angry god. The walls of the prefabricated structure groaned and flexed, and somewhere in the distance, she heard the sharp crack of metal giving way under pressure. She grabbed her pack and ran for the door outside. The world had transformed into chaos. The sky was the color of a deep bruise, purple and black and shot through with veins of electric white. The wind howled between the buildings with a sound like a wounded animal, and debris flew through the air. With enough force to kill, all personnel to Emergency Shelter Alpha. A voice crackled over the camp's communication system, barely audible above the roar of the storm. Repeat. All personnel to Emergency Shelter Alpha. Yuna fought her way across the camp. Leaning into the wind with every step, she passed overturned equipment and scattered supplies. Saw crew members struggling toward the central shelter, while others worked frantically to secure what they could. A massive electromagnetic pulse lit up the sky, and every piece of electronic equipment in the camp flickered and died. The communication system went silent. The lights in the shelters blinked out. Emergency generators kicked in a moment later, casting everything in a dim red glow. Yuna reached the main shelter just as Mira emerged from the environmental monitoring station. "I warned them," Myra shouted over the wind. "I warned them this was coming. How bad is it going to get?" Myra's face was grim. "This is just the beginning." They entered the shelter together and found organized chaos inside. Torvax was barking orders while his crew worked to set up backup systems and treat the injured in the corner. Yuna saw the two adult Velthari huddled together, and her blood ran cold when she realized what was wrong. One of them was bleeding from a deep gash across their shoulder, and the other was cradling an arm that bent at an unnatural angle. But it was not their injuries that filled Yuna with dread. It was the wild, desperate look in their eyes as they stared at the door. "The young one," Yuna said to Myra. "Where is the adolescent?" "They were not with them when I came in." Yuna pushed through the crowd until she reached the Velthari. They looked up at her with eyes full of fear and pain and something else. Something that looked like hope when they recognized her. "Where are your children?" Yuna asked. Speaking slowly and clearly, the Velthari with the wounded shoulder struggled to respond, their voice thick with pain and an accent that made their words difficult to understand. "Transport pod. They managed. Kept them safe there during the day. Cubs inside when storm came." The other Velthari let out a sound of pure anguish. "We tried to reach them. They said equipment fell on us. Pod is on the other side of the camp." Yuna felt the blood drain from her face. "How many cubs?" "3. They are only babies." Yuna did not think. She did not weigh the risks or consider the consequences. She simply turned and ran for the door. "Human." Torvax's voice thundered behind her. "Where do you think you were going? There are children out there." Yuna shouted back without stopping. 3 Velthari cubs in a transport pod. That pod is designed to withstand severe conditions. It is not designed for this," Yuna said, gesturing at the window, where another electromagnetic burst turned night into day for a blinding instant. "Nothing is designed for this." She was through the door before anyone could stop her. The wind hit her like a physical force, and she staggered but did not fall. She could barely see 3 meters in front of her face, but she knew the layout of the camp, and she knew where the transport pods were stored. Each step was a battle against the wind and the flying debris. Something struck her leg and pain flared bright and hot, but she kept moving. A piece of metal sheeting flew past her head, so close she felt it brush her hair. By the time she reached the transport pod, her body was covered in cuts and bruises, and her lungs burned from the effort of breathing against the wind. The pod was intact, but when she pried open the door, she found the 3 cubs inside, shivering and crying, and already dangerously cold Velthari cubs. She remembered from her studies, could not regulate their body temperature in extreme conditions. They depended on adult body heat to survive cold environments. Without their parents, they would not last the night. "It is okay," Yuna said softly, gathering the three small bodies into her arms. "I am here now. I am going to keep you safe." The largest cub looked up at her with wide, terrified eyes. "You are the small one," they said in broken common. The one they laughed at. "Yes," Yuna said. "I am the small one, and I am going to get you through this." She looked back toward the main shelter, and her heart sank. The path was now completely impassable, blocked by debris and wreckage from collapsed structures. Even if she could fight her way through, the shelter was full of metal equipment that was attracting the electromagnetic discharges like a magnet. Every few seconds, lightning struck somewhere nearby, and she could smell the sharp scent of ozone and burning. There was another option. She had seen it on her way here. A rocky outcropping that formed the natural alcove about 50 meters to the east. It was solid stone, no metal, and it would provide shelter from the wind. It would also be cold, colder than the transport pod, with no heating and no insulation, but it would not attract lightning. Yuna made her decision. She wrapped the cubs tightly in her thermal jacket and held them against her chest, shielding their bodies with her own as she fought her way toward the rocks. The wind seemed to sense her purpose and fought against her with renewed fury. Twice she fell and twice she forced herself back to her feet, her arms never loosening their grip on the precious bundles against her chest. When she finally reached the alcove, she was shaking so badly she could barely stand. The space was small, barely large enough for her to sit with her back against the stone, but it was protected from the direct force of the wind. She arranged the cubs in her lap, pressing them close to her body, and wrapped her arms around all three of them. "There," she said, her teeth already chattering. "We are going to be fine." The smallest cub buried their face against her neck. "I am scared," they whimpered. "I know," Yuna said, "but I have got you. I am not going to let go." Outside the alcove, the storm raged with impossible violence, and the temperature continued to drop. Yuna could feel the cold seeping into her bones, could feel her muscles beginning to cramp from the strain of holding the cubs close. She had no way of knowing how long the storm would last. She had no way of calling for help. All she could do was hold on and hope that her body heat would be enough to keep three small lives burning through the darkness. She was small. She was weak. She had nothing to offer except herself, so she offered everything she had. The shuttle descended through clouds of pale green gas, and Dr. Yuna Park pressed her face against the viewport, like a child seeing snow for the first time. Vora 7 stretched below them, a moon of gray rock and deep purple valleys that cut across the landscape like ancient scars. She had dreamed of this moment for 3 years, ever since the first images of the ruins had reached Earth and set the entire xenorchaeology community into a frenzy. Now she was here, assigned to the most important dig site in a century, and she could barely contain her excitement. "Human," a deep voice rumbled from behind her. "You are blocking the equipment access panel." Yuna turned and looked up at senior researcher Torvax, who towered over her by nearly 2 meters. The Krellian's scales were the color of dried blood, and his yellow eyes regarded her with the same interest one might give to a piece of furniture that had been placed in an inconvenient location. "I apologize," Yuna said quickly, stepping aside. Torvax made a sound in his throat that might have been acknowledgement, or might have been dismissal. It was hard to tell with Krellians. They had joined the Galactic Union 800 years ago, and in all that time they had never been known for their warmth toward other species. The shuttle touched down with a gentle bump, and the rear doors hissed open to reveal a landscape that took Yuna's breath away. The ruins rose from the valley floor like the bones of some tremendous creature. towers of black stone that had stood for perhaps a million years. No one knew who had built them or why they had been abandoned. That was what this expedition hoped to discover. All personnel will gather at the base camp for assignment, Torvax announced as he strode down the ramp, his massive feet leaving deep impressions in the gray dust. Yuna grabbed her pack and followed, trying to keep pace with his enormous stride. She was not the only human on the expedition, but she was certainly the smallest member of the team, at barely over 1.5 meters tall. She came up to the chest of most species and barely reached the waist of the Krellians. Yuna, a familiar voice called out, and she turned to see Specialist Mira Sung jogging toward her. Myra was the expedition's environmental technician, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a perpetual look of concern on her face. "You made it," Myra said, falling into step beside her. "I was starting to worry they would find an excuse to leave you behind." "They tried," Yuna admitted. "3 times the paperwork was mysteriously lost, and twice my security clearance was revoked without explanation." Mira shook her head. "Torvax does not want humans on this expedition, and he has made that clear to everyone who will listen." "Then, why are we here at all?" "Politics," Myra said with a shrug. Earth pushed hard for representation, and the Union Council agreed that human scientists should be included. She lowered her voice, "But that does not mean they have to give us anything meaningful to do." They reached the base camp, a collection of prefabricated shelters arranged in a rough circle around a central communications array. Teams were already unloading equipment and setting up workstations while a group of unfamiliar aliens stood apart from the chaos, watching everything with careful eyes. Yuna studied them with curiosity. They were feline in appearance, with sleek fur that ranged from silver to deep amber and large ears that swiveled independently to track sounds. 2 of them were clearly adults, their movements graceful and confident, while a third was smaller and stayed close to the others with the nervous energy of an adolescent Velthari. Mira said quietly, "They are here to observe the expedition as part of their application to join the Union." "I have read about them," Yuna said. "They are supposed to be incredibly protective of their young, which makes it interesting that they brought one with them." Before Yuna could respond, Torvax's voice boomed across the camp. "All personnel will report to the assignment station immediately." The next hour was a masterclass in subtle humiliation. Torvax read out assignments with obvious pleasure, giving the most important tasks to his fellow Krellians and their allies, while the humans received whatever was left over. Mira was assigned to monitor weather patterns, a task that kept her far from the actual dig site, and Yuna was given the role of cataloging storage containers. "There must be some mistake," Yuna said when her name was called. "I have 2 advanced degrees in xenarchaeology, and I was specifically requested for this mission because of my expertise in pre-Union civilizations." Torvax looked down at her with something that might have been amusement. "The containers require cataloging," he said. "Are you saying the task is beneath you?" "I am saying it is a waste of my skills." "Your skills," Torvax repeated. And several of the Krellians nearby made sounds that Yuna recognized as laughter. "Human? You are here because your government insisted upon it and for no other reason." He leaned down until his face was close to hers, and she could smell the sharp metallic scent of his breath. "You are small and you are weak, and you have nothing to offer this expedition, except perhaps entertainment." He straightened and turned away. "Report to Storage Bay 7. Yuna stood frozen for a moment, her face burning with shame and anger. She felt Myra's hand on her shoulder. "Do not let him see that it bothers you," Myra whispered. "That is exactly what he wants." Yuna nodded and forced herself to walk toward the storage bays with her head held high. She would not give Torvax the satisfaction of seeing her defeated. As she passed the Velthari observers, The adolescent turned to watch her with large golden eyes. There was something in that gaze that Yuna could not identify. Something that looked almost like recognition. The adult Valtteri spoke to the young one in their own language and gently guided them away. Yuna spent the rest of the day in the storage bay, surrounded by crates of equipment that she dutifully scanned and logged into the expedition database. It was mindless work, and it gave her far too much time to think through the narrow window of the bay. She could see the sky changing color as the day wore on. The pale green had darkened to something closer to purple, and clouds were gathering on the horizon in thick, heavy masses. She pulled up the weather data on her tablet and frowned at what she saw: the storm. Systems on Verith 7 were notoriously unpredictable, but these readings suggested something significant was building. She flagged the data and sent it to Mira with a note, expressing her concern. An hour later, she received a response. "I saw it too, and I reported it to Torvax." A pause. Then another message. He said the storms never come this early in the season, and that I was being paranoid. Yuna looked out the window again. The clouds were closer now, and within them she could see flashes of light that were not quite lightning. Electromagnetic discharges. She realized, the kind that could destroy sensitive equipment and make communication impossible. She had a bad feeling about this, but she was just a human. Small and weak and assigned to catalog. Containers. What could she possibly know that the great senior researcher Torvax did not? She returned to her work and tried to ignore the growing sense of dread that settled in her stomach like a stone outside. The sky continued to darken, and the first winds began to blow across the valley, carrying with them the promise of something terrible.